On April 1st, 1517, one of the most influential letters in all of Christian history was sent. To Dr. Martin Luther, I am at your service. I have informed my friend Johann Eck of your virtue, and therefore he is very eager for your friendship. Evidently, Christoph von Scheul, the author of the letter, was right on the money. The two became fast friends. They shared a real love of theology, but specifically the philosophical side of it. In fact, when Luther crafted his 95 Theses, he actually wrote to Eck for advice on how to expand and explain them better. 8 months later, Luther would call that same man a whore. History remembers these men not as friends, but as bitter rivals. In fact, if you were to just stick to the fount of all knowledge, Wikipedia, you'd find no mention of their friendship on Luther's page. And on X, barely half a sentence. So that's the story I want to look at today. The story of a friendship that, honestly, I couldn't find even many historians talking about at length. A story that I had to piece together myself from hundreds of letters, several pamphlets, and one very long transcript. A story about friendship, faith, and failure. A story about wanting to keep the church together, but inevitably splitting it apart. The story of Martin Luther and Johann Eck. The story of the Leipzig debate. And if you want to read any of these letters for yourself, by all means, please look at the companion document, which I have linked in the video description, which will have direct links to every single source I bring up in this video. And occasionally, if you see a number on screen like this, it works like a footnote, either to reference a specific source or to add context that doesn't fit in the video. But let's begin our story by introducing our two main characters. First, we have Eck. Born in 1486, he'd get his master's at just 15. After taking a break to publish some writings, he would eventually get his doctorate at 24. His specific writings on usury and free will gained international attention, and both of them led to very public debates that he did so well at that he eventually secured the patronage of the Fuggers family. YouTube, that's Fuggers with a G. But it was originally spelled that way, so go figure. He was known for his encyclopedic memory, his fiery oration, and his brilliant theological reasoning. Luther, on the other hand, had far more humble beginnings. Born in 1483, he would get his master's at the age of 22, after which he'd immediately join law school. But within a year, he'd drop out and join a monastery. One likely apocryphal story relates that his horse almost killed him, and he said that he would devote his life to Christ if he was spared. In 1512, at the ripe old age of 29, he'd eventually receive his doctorate in theology, going on to replace his mentor, Johann Staupitz, as the chair of theology at the University of Wittenberg. Luther's lectures would receive praise from his fellow faculty members, and he would publish a few of his works as well, but nothing that he did really made waves anywhere near the level of Eck's. No, what would eventually catapult Luther into the limelight was a broke archbishop. This was Albert, Archbishop of Mainz, lovely town by the way, who had fallen into some debt due to paying for his spot in the Roman Curia. Back in the day, it wasn't uncommon for the Catholic Church to sell certain church positions in order to raise money for all the good works they were doing. As a result, Albert had gone into 20,000 florins of debt in order to pay for his spot in the Roman Curia. Currency conversion over long time periods like this is almost always tricky and unreliable, but if you want a really rough ballpark, that's like $1 million USD. Now, at the same time, the Pope, Leo X, was in the middle of remodeling St. Peter's Basilica, taking it from something that looked like this to the modern-day version, which looks like this. Not exactly a cheap undertaking. Therefore, Albert wrote to the Pope and suggested a solution to their shared problem. Would it be all right if Albert could sell some indulgences in Germany and split the profits with the Pope? The Pope agreed, and Albert sent one Johann Tetzel out into Germany to begin selling salvation. Now, a lot of people have heard of the concept of indulgences, but to be honest, they're often misunderstood. So it merits a brief explanation. To grossly oversimplify, in the Catholic faith, when you sin, two things happen. One, you fall from grace, and two, your soul gets tainted. The first is pretty easy to solve. You go to confession, say sorry to God, genuinely truly mean it in your heart, and God forgives you. Grace is restored, and you're good to go. The second, however, is a lot harder. To get rid of that stain on your soul, you usually have to perform good works. However, most people die without performing nearly enough good works to completely cleanse their soul. Therefore, you're sent to a place called purgatory, where you are punished for some number of years, in order to cleanse your soul, and then you can enter the kingdom of heaven. As St. Paul is quoted as saying in the book of Sopranos,
I figure I'm going to have to do about 6,000 years before I get accepted into heaven. And 6,000 years is nothing in eternity terms.
Importantly, though, indulgences do not forgive sin, nor do they guarantee salvation. It's not like you can just go around killing people and denying Christ and then donate $1 billion to the church and get into heaven. Doesn't work that way. Tetzel, however, was breaking those rules. Or, well, maybe. I'm going to put some more context in the companion document because this is actually a very confusing part of the story, because I can find scholars saying everything I'm about to say is right and scholars saying everything I'm about to say is wrong. Firstly, Tetzel was hinting his indulgences guaranteed salvation, specifically stating, when the coin from the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. And secondly, he was selling indulgences for sins not yet committed. As you may know, Luther took issue with this. But I want to be very clear here. Luther was not opposed to indulgences. At least, not at this time. If you'd like to read Luther's theses for yourself, go ahead and check them out here. But his main argument was that indulgences themselves were not something the Pope granted. They were something that God granted. So the Pope saying, here, have a certificate that I've signed that guarantees you get some remission from penance without any addition of prayer, good works, sincerity, really any vetting of the people receiving these indulgences is not necessarily something that we can sign off on. What is also often said, and something I also thought was true before I started this research, is that Luther nailed his theses to a door on October 31st. That almost certainly did not happen, because Luther never wanted to make his theses public. In fact, in a letter to Christoph Schul, Luther would express regret over the theses publication, specifically stating, I wish to publish a booklet in German on the power of indulgences, so that I can suppress these quite indefinite theses. Of course, it is not doubtful to me that the people are deceived, not by the indulgence, but by its use. Now, you might be wondering, if Luther didn't nail these theses to a church door, how did anyone even find out about them? Well, simple. Luther shared most of them with his friends at the university, but he also mailed off 2 copies of the theses. One to his local bishop, Hieronymus Schulz, and the other to Archbishop Albert. Now, in a twist anyone could have seen coming, Albert wasn't the biggest fan of being told that maybe he was making money unethically. And so, after holding on to him for a few months, forwarded them off to Rome with a little letter attached saying, hey, do any of these theses kind of sound heretical to anyone else? So Luther's 95 Theses are printed and sold almost immediately, and they're quite popular. They're widespread in Germany by early 1518. We're talking January. Immediately, Tetzel and others responded, Tetzel having, understandably, some of the harshest comments, saying that Luther should be burned at the stake as a heretic. Luther was working on publishing a longer version of his 95 Theses that he was hoping would clear up any ambiguities. However, before that could happen, his original 95 Theses eventually make their way to Johann Eck. It's possible Eck came across them by himself, and it's also possible that he was sent them by the dean of his university. But either way, Eck would eventually write what was known as the Obelisks, essentially a critique of Luther's 95 Theses. Eck mailed the document to his bishop and a few friends, and it seems like, to him at least, it was more of a mental exercise, a very brief, just kind of jotting down of ideas, than a serious, real scholarly takedown. However, within that document, Eck says that a couple of Luther's ideas are kind of similar to the ideas of this other guy, one Jan Hus, one of the most famous heretics of that age. And this struck everyone the same way. Eck was also calling Luther a heretic. Now, Jan Hus had started a church that was creatively known as the Hussites. They'd fought a whole war over this, creatively known as the Hussite War. And only recently, in 1512, had they actually settled things, drafting up a truce between the Catholic Church and the Hussites in Bohemia. Eck's writings circulated, and eventually they wound up in the hands of one Andreas Carlstadt, a professor at Wittenberg University. Understandably, at a time when so many people were attacking him for heresy, Eck's comments struck Luther as a betrayal. Luther would write a letter to Eck on May 19th of 1518. It's quite scathing, with lines like, "For what whore, who is a little angry, could not spew the same vituperations and disparagements that you have spewed against me?" Yeah, Luther is not mincing words there. Luther's response to the Obelisks was called the Asterisks, for, correction. Luther attaches the Asterisks to that letter he sent Eck, which he has not yet published, but tells him he will eventually. Eck responds to that by writing a letter to Carlstadt, for some reason, who, as far as I could tell, never wrote to Eck in the first place. I'm not sure I could call this letter an apology, because Eck never really apologizes for anything, but given the blistering nature of Luther's letter, X is quite kind by comparison. He says things like, "My intention was not to attack Martin," and even that he thought his words might have been a bit careless. He would have put more thought into them if he knew how far they would reach. We all take more liberty in private writing than when we put a piece of writing into the light. Now, we do have evidence that Eck may have tried to reach out to Luther indirectly through their mutual friend Schurl, as Luther writes that what he had asked on behalf of Eck was unnecessary, as Luther had read Eck's letter to Carlstadt and now considered the matter settled. Interestingly, in that same letter, Luther actually indicates he also has written back to Eck with a letter full of very kind words and apologies, so it does seem as though he was open to making amends, even though also in that letter, he doesn't think Eck's going to come around. A part of me wonders if the reason Eck didn't directly reach out to Luther was he was expecting that same level of vitriol that he'd gotten before, or perhaps that Luther would have just chucked his letter in the fire. And we do have a letter from Eck to Luther directly from September of that year, 1518. In his later September letter to Luther, Eck very clearly feels hurt, though. If not by the Asterisks, then at the very least by Luther's quite cruel letter from May. Eck still takes the time to say that he does agree with one of Luther's responses to a different critic of Luther's. Not completely, of course, but still. It's honestly kind of an odd moment. Perhaps Eck is open to repairing the friendship, even if there'd been some serious damage. Now, in Eck's letter to Carlstadt, he'd said, "Hey, if you guys are about to push back against me, I think it'd be polite if you at least sent that to me first, rather than just publishing it publicly." Remember, up to this point, none of this was public. This was all just letters that were being circulated behind the scenes. Carlstadt responded to Eck on June 11th of 1518 with a weird letter. It opens with him attacking Eck, saying, "I am quite distressed that, due to your arrogance, we are forced to attack you." But then later also says, "But I would not like to lose your friendship. I love you dearly. I would be lost if I wished you death or the slightest misfortune." Ending with, "Yes, long live Eck, our friend. But if he is an enemy to us, let him become a lover of the truth." However, in his letter, Carlstadt claims he's already published his response to Eck, 405 sentences in defense of Holy Scripture. Meanwhile, on August 7th, Luther gets a letter that drafts the first case of heresy against him. Luther sends a copy of the response he sent off to a friend on August 31st, although in that letter to his friend, he refers to his response as farcical and off the cuff. Regardless of how seriously Luther took the summons, he was still summoned, and heretics usually didn't fare too well if they made it all the way to Rome. Luckily for Luther, though, the stars had aligned so perfectly that he never ended up having to make that likely one-way trip. The very short version to explain why is that Luther's liege lord, Frederick III, also known as Frederick the Wise, was actively being courted by the Pope at the time, because the Pope wanted to make him the next emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Because if it wasn't going to be Frederick, it was going to be this other guy named Charles V, a Habsburg, if the chin didn't give it away. At the time, though, Charles V was already king of Spain, meaning he didn't just control Spain, he also controlled Sardinia and Naples, which was all of southern Italy at the time. So if he also got control of the Holy Roman Empire, well, A, he's basically boxing the Pope in, and B, he's basically controlling more land than anyone else in Europe. So Frederick asked the Pope if Luther could just stand trial in Augsburg instead, a city in Germany. The Pope agreed, and in October, Luther would arrive there to meet with Cardinal Cajetan. Now, while Luther was in Augsburg for the trial, which I'll cover in a second, he also apparently met with Eck. I can't find any scholars mentioning this moment, so it's possible I'm completely misinterpreting this. But in November of 1518, Luther would send a letter to Eck saying Carlstadt was willing to debate him as they had negotiated at Augsburg, implying Luther had brokered the debate there. And the letter is pretty polite and friendly. He even says, Indeed, that the adversaries hope in vain that the theologians will always quarrel among themselves and never compare. While Luther's trial in Augsburg is interesting, it's not super relevant to the story we're examining today. So I'll put some more in the companion doc if you want to read about that, but the TLDR is that Luther got in a screaming match with a cardinal and ended up having to flee the city under cover of darkness out of fear he'd be arrested. He would arrive back in Wittenberg in late October, sending that letter to Eck in November, as we mentioned. Which is going to bring us to the year that is the main focus of this video. 1519. Well, technically we have to start with December 28th, 1518. Eck publishes the Notice of the Debate with Carlstadt. It will take place next summer at Leipzig University. In addition, he publishes 12 theses he's willing to defend, of which maybe a third deal with Carlstadt's critiques, half if we're being generous. But clearly, who the target of most of these theses are is Luther. It's pretty clear what's happening. Although technically Luther is not a named party in this debate, the debate was going to be about Luther. In response, Luther wrote and published an open letter, ostensibly addressed to Carlstadt, pushing back against all of Eck's theses. Luther says things like, Eck makes a noise with splendid, pompous words, but this is the manner of the man. And I would have never considered him worthy of my disputation if it had not been necessary, for the sake of Christ's people, to put an end to the seducers, the useless talkers, the self-seekers, the shameless profit-seekers. On February 18th, Luther would write a further private letter to Eck that really spelled out how far apart the two had become. I am sorry, dear Eck, that finally, through such obvious evidence, your friendship towards me is found to be a hypocritical one. Initially, when this was made public, there was some pushback, and the university canceled the debate between Eck and Carlstadt. However, Eck would write a letter to Luther on February 19th, informing him that he had spoken to the Duke of the region, Duke George, and had that ruling overturned, meaning the debate was back on, and even gave Luther a specific date of June 27th, and he invited Luther to attend the debate. Yes, attend, not participate. Eck wanted Luther to sit in the cuck chair. After this goad, Luther would write the University of Leipzig and ask that he be allowed to debate. The university would reply, of course, and would even go so far as to attack Luther for implying they'd ever denied his request for a debate, as, to their credit, they'd never gotten one. Luther would then write to Duke George, Duke in charge of the area that controlled the university, to ask him for permission to debate. The Duke answered that he had received letters from Eck about Carlstadt, but not from Luther. If Eck would just write the Duke and confirm that he also wanted to debate Luther, the Duke would allow it, but until such a time would forbid it. This was March 4th. On March 14th, Eck would respond to Luther's open letter publicly with his own open letter, in which he sort of mocks Luther, specifically saying at one point, Luther is unhappy about the fact that, while I had promised to dispute against Carlstadt in Leipzig, I directed the attack against him. I did not think that these people had to be separated in the disputation, who fought tooth and nail for one and the same opinion. Eck would also add a 13th thesis in the number 7 slot for some reason, which dealt with free will and grace. This was at least pointedly aimed at Carlstadt. However, Eck would also change the title of his letter, where he now referred to the theses as theses opposed to Luther and Carlstadt. Eck would finish the letter by saying that he was more than happy to debate both of them, saying, I will argue against both of them for the truth of the faith and for the protection of the apostolic see. Thus, a month later, Luther wrote Eck on April 5th, informing him of his correspondence with the Duke, and that all Eck needed to do was write his own letter to the Duke and the debate would be approved. To which Eck never responded. So Luther wrote the Duke a few weeks later, April 28th, saying, okay, fine, maybe Eck hadn't given his explicit permission to the Duke yet, but he'd put out that public letter saying that he was happy to debate Luther. Shouldn't that count? But the Duke gave the same reply. Without a direct letter from Eck saying that he was cool with this, Luther would not be allowed to debate. Luther wrote to the Duke again on May 16th, barely a month before the debate, saying that, look, he didn't know why Eck wasn't writing to the Duke, but Eck had publicly challenged him. That should be enough, right? Come on, please, please, please let Luther debate. But the Duke would respond the same way. Without a letter from Eck, Luther would not be allowed to debate. In a letter to Johann dated June 6th, 3 weeks before the debate was scheduled to begin, Luther said that he still hadn't received permission, but at this point, he was going to attend anyway. Luther and Carlstadt, accompanied by many other members of the Wittenberg faculty, arrived in Leipzig on June 24th. Carlstadt was summoned alone to agree to the terms of the debate. There was some wiggling. See the companion doc if you want a breakdown of what happened there. But on June 26th, he signed the document, ready to debate the following day. And then Luther was summoned. In the official recounting of the events of the disputation, it's stated that Luther could not debate without the permission of Duke George. Eck, who was burning with desire to compete with Luther, provided him with this permission. The only other real account from this comes from a much later letter of Luther's, in which he says that Eck came to visit him in his lodgings that evening, saying that he didn't want to debate Carlstadt at all if he couldn't debate Luther. Luther informed him that he needed permission in order to debate Eck, and Eck said he'd get him that permission. Personally, I don't understand why Eck would not respond to Luther. In the debate itself, he will claim he's been busy for the past couple months, so perhaps the letters just never reached him. He was unaware of the issue to begin with. Another part of me wonders if Eck hoped Luther just wouldn't show, and that Eck could claim Luther had run away after his very public call-out. Luther would indeed report in a letter that after he'd been summoned to agree to terms for the debate, and he had a few issues with the terms Carlstadt had agreed to, that Eck's entire cohort started claiming that Luther was now trying to back out of the debate on a technicality. Therefore, Luther didn't actually end up signing the agreement to the debate until July 4th. Thus, the debate did not kick off with the headliners. Instead, it began with Carlstadt v. Eck. As for a summary of the first debate, Nicholas von Armsdorf, another Wittenberger, puts it best. Eck surpasses Dr. Carlstadt by far with his memory and pronouncement, so that I was sorry the matter had begun. Not that Eck had won, prevailed, and triumphed, but that if the deal had not been put to the quill, our camp would have returned home in great shame. Carlstadt was the classic academic. Deep, source-based arguments were the core of his attacks. But even those on his side would say that he was kind of boring. Eck, on the other hand, was a brilliant, powerful orator whose rhetoric was often far more important than any specific argument he was bringing up. Even Luther would say that Eck delighted to excite laughter, sometimes even among the audience. Modern historians all agree that Eck lost this debate. He'd basically end up agreeing with Carlstadt's position around day 2. However, everyone in the room thought that Eck had won this debate because he was just a lot more entertaining to listen to. If you want to read a fuller explanation, you can check the companion doc, but basically it came down to a fairly semantic argument that Eck was able to win, again through rhetorical strength, rather than actual genuine sourcing arguments or knowledge. So the stakes were clear and the stage was set. In the wee hours of the morning on July 4th, the two former friends would arrive at the auditorium. At 7 o'clock sharp, they would begin the debate which they had started nearly 2 years ago. Now, one note on the format of this debate. Unlike modern kind of political online debates that you see between streamers sometimes, these debates did not take place in a couple hours. They were 3 days minimum apiece, with each day sometimes being as long as 12 hours. Each individual mini-debate was focused on a specific thesis. So we're just going to be focusing on one of those debates. Frankly, the only debate that anyone thought was worth their time. But if you'd like to read the full transcript of not just that debate, but any of the other ones, feel free to check the companion doc. They're all there. Carlstadt and Eck's debate had been rather well attended, but the debate between Luther and Eck was packed. The Chancellor of Saxony at the time, a man named Pfeiffer, would remark, "Many people, out of eagerness to hear such famous men discuss the most important things, traveled from far and foreign places. Nevertheless, of 3 bishops and 11 abbots in the land of the Dukes of Saxony, not a single one showed up at this so crowded and famous scene." And as a reminder, the most complete English version that's available online is a machine translation from DeepL. So occasionally when I put up the quotes, I'm going to say things that don't reflect the text on screen. But again, it's because I'm cross-referencing it with the original German, both of which again are linked in the companion document. Luther's opening statement was short and to the point. He would have avoided this debate if he could, but Eck insisted. He also called out many who had attacked him in writing, but then refused to show up in person to see him debate. Eck was similarly brief, if a bit more flowery, and then launched into his first thesis. "There is a monarchy and a single principality in the church by divine right, and instituted by Christ. For this church militant, which is like one body, as Paul says, is ordained and fashioned after the image of the church triumphant, in which there is one monarch over all subjects, they being arranged in ranks up to the one head, namely God. A like order, therefore, was set up on earth by Christ. Then, just for good measure, he throws in a subtle dig at Luther. Hence, he who refuses to be under the head is not from heaven, just as he who will not submit to God is not from heaven, but Lucifer. Pretty, isn't it? That's Eck for you. A part of me wishes when he said Lucifer, he'd had a Freudian slip and said Luther, but no such luck. Eck's argument here is that the church militant, the church on earth, must be a reflection of the church triumphant, the church in heaven, as on earth as it is in heaven, as above so below, all that good stuff. So therefore, since the church triumphant in heaven has God as its head, the church militant on earth must also have a head. With that, Eck resumed his seat and yielded the floor for Luther, whom, I imagine, calmly got up and said the following 3 sentences. When the doctor argues that there is one universal head of the church, he says very well, if there is anyone who, by some private covenant, has agreed to defend the opposite, let him step forth. This argument does not concern me. Luther then sat back down. Now, if you're a bit confused, after all, wasn't this argument over the primacy of the Pope? You're not alone in that. Eck was as well. Eck responded that if the head of the church wasn't the Pope, well, then Luther needed to answer who the head of the church was. Eck backed up the idea that it should be the Pope with a quote from Saint Cyprian, a saint and early church father, in which he refers to the bishopric of Rome as the chair of Saint Peter, from which priestly unity takes its origin. For those unfamiliar, Saint Peter, an apostle of Jesus, founded the bishopric of Rome and served as its first bishop. The bishopric of Rome currently is the bishopric the Pope holds. Therefore, Peter is often viewed as the first pope, even by the modern Catholic Church. He further argues that without a head, some kind of final authority to settle theological disputes, well, then the church was opening itself up for basically infinite schisms. Cyprian remarks that heretics always seek to first remove the head in order to more easily spread their poison. Eck further argues that far from just preventing schisms, the church having a head actually helps encourage unity among the priests, backing this up with a quote from St. Jerome. Jerome, far from just any church father, was the author of the Vulgate Bible, basically the definitive version of the Latin Bible for the past millennium. I want to be associated with the chair of Peter. I know that upon that rock the church is founded. Jerome here is referencing a well-known Bible verse that will become a focal point of the debate later. Thus, Eck's line of attack is clearly laid out. Peter was the first pope and was appointed to be such by Christ himself, and the church needed a head to have a single authority to refer to on theological disputes. Eck passes it back to Luther in his usual style. Now let the Reverend Father indicate another monarchy in the church in former times, who rose to give his first real response. One Eck was wholly unprepared for. That there is a monarchy in the church militant, and that its head is not a man, but Christ himself, I fully profess, and that on divine authority. In 1 Corinthians 15, we read, "He must reign until all enemies are put under his feet." Going on to say, "Accordingly, we must not listen at all to persons who push Christ out of the church militant into the church triumphant. For his kingdom is one of faith. That is, we do not see our head, and yet we have him for our head." Luther's counter to Eck came sharply into focus. He wasn't denying there was a head of the church. He was saying the head of the church was the person who started it, aka Jesus. This was a subtle but deadly answer to Eck's opening. What was Eck's response supposed to be? That the Pope had more authority than God? He now went on to prove that, far from being Carlstadt, he was not someone Eck could bully with obscure sources, because Luther now showed that he was familiar with every single source Eck had brought up and began tearing into them. For Eck's Cyprian quote about heretics removing the head to more easily spread their poison, Luther points out that that doesn't refer to Rome, it refers to basically any bishop, further offering a letter of Cyprian that affirms bishops should be chosen according to local custom, not appointed from some central source like Rome. He further points out that the Bishop of Rome, aka the Pope, was originally just chosen by the faithful of Rome, just like any other bishop in the early days of the church. Luther further argues that if priestly unity is where the Pope's authority comes from, well, shouldn't that authority rightly go to the first church? You know, the one that established everything else? The church in Jerusalem? For Eck's whole "we need to prevent schisms" argument, Luther points out that the Greek Orthodox Church has never recognized the authority of the Pope, yet even to this day they were not considered heretical. And the quote Eck used to back that argument up from St. Jerome doesn't necessarily imply what Eck's saying it implies, because Luther points out Jerome has another letter to someone named Evagrius where he states, "Wherever there may be a bishop, whether at Rome or Eugubium or Constantinople or Rhegium or Alexandria or Thane, his worth and episcopal office is the same. All are successors of the apostles." Luther finishes this off with a direct quote from Jesus, where at the Last Supper the apostles are arguing amongst themselves over who might be the greatest, to which Jesus responds, in typical Jesus fashion, "The greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves." The arguments of both parties were now laid bare. Eck's claim was that just as God the Father ruled in heaven, so must there be a ruler here on earth. Luther's reply was we already had one, God the Son. Eck's response, in my opinion, left a lot to be desired. First, Eck mocked Luther's use of sources. "The Reverend Father has entered the lists quite well informed. He has his materials arranged in good order in the book which he has written and published. But I came here to debate, not publish a book." Yeah, not the best look to be like, "Nice sources, nerd, but I'm just going to use my brain, thanks." The argument, to be fair, worked against Carlstadt, but it fell pretty flat against Luther here. I'm guessing Eck was caught a little flat-footed here because the rest of his response is mostly just defending his own arguments. In fact, aside from one odd moment that would become a theme of the debate where Eck would claim the Greek Orthodox Church actually was heretical, he really would only make two more arguments. Firstly, while Christ is obviously the head of the church, the head can always appoint subordinates to act in its stead. And in those subordinates can always appear the character of the head. Think about stewards versus kings. Secondly, Rome must be the rock, the central church, because in 1519, the rest of the great churches weren't exactly controlled by Christians. Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, and depending on who you ask, Istanbul or Constantinople, these were all under Muslim control. Eck rounds off by explaining away Luther's Last Supper quote by pointing out that Jesus wasn't necessarily saying none of them would be the greatest. He was instead just trying to impart an idea of this is how leaders should act. Again, Eck was very clearly unprepared for this line of attack. Though, also to be fair, Luther had played the opening beautifully. He hadn't really committed to a position until Eck had committed to his. He had flexed not only his ability to source, but his ability to engage with Eck's sources. And lastly, he never rose to the bait of Eck indirectly calling Luther a heretic. It was cold, calm, and calculated. The exact opposite of Eck's style. However, this was far from Eck's first debate, and he understood the format of debates quite well. And so he did end up succeeding in one respect. He had run out the clock until lunch. You see, the debates always had two sessions, a morning session and an afternoon session. The morning session went from 7 o'clock until lunch, which, from what it seems, was either around noon or 1. And then the afternoon session would usually resume around 2 o'clock, going until, I assume, 7, but it would probably depend on sundown and when they'd have to start lighting candles and stuff like that. Therefore, during lunch, Eck had a little bit of time to try and cobble together a few sources to get him through the rest of the first day. But as he was the one who had run down the clock, when they returned from lunch, it was Luther's turn. There isn't too much more in this line of argumentation because obviously Eck hadn't really come up with a good counter-argument yet. But his only real new point is that all the apostles were equal and subservient to their true head, Christ. Luther began by returning to his earlier Corinthians reference with a later one from the same letter, saying, "All things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Peter or the world or life or death. And ye are Christ's, and Christ is God's." Again, this idea of equality, of everything serving and being under God. Pointing out that when it came time to replace Judas, the apostle who had betrayed Christ, they didn't believe they were worthy of appointing his successor, and so drew lots in an effort to get some input from heaven. In the same way that Peter was not the head of the apostles, it's unlikely that the early church had a singular distinct head. So saying, Luther sat down, waiting to see if Eck had used his time at lunch wisely. Eck begins with, "Although Luther rightly prefers Paul to Jerome, we shall have to believe, if we wish to be God-fearing men, that Jerome has correctly understood the meaning of Paul." Essentially saying, yeah, Luther, you're right, the word of God is above all words of men. But your words are of men. Paul, for those who don't know, is a very famous early church father who also wrote several letters that are in the Bible itself. And if Luther were to say, Paul means this, but a saint were to say, no, he actually means this, why would we take Luther's words over that of a literal saint? It's a clever move from Eck, allowing him to continue to use the sources he'd prepared beforehand, shifting the argument from what the scripture says to how the scripture should be interpreted. He then pivots into his own explanation of church history to explain the power of the Pope. Eck explains that while Luther is right, the Pope was initially chosen directly by the faithful of Rome. After the Church has received its proper order, the choice of a Pope has been delegated to the cardinals by an order of Pope Nicholas. But I believe there were cardinals at the time of Jerome, or Jerome could not have been a cardinal priest. Whereupon Luther interjected, saying, Jerome was never a cardinal. Not to be deterred, Eck moved on to the Cyprian quote about removing the head in order to better spread poison, talking about how the heretics he's specifically mentioning were attacking Rome. They were Numidians, which came from the other side of the Atlas Mountains, upon which Luther interjected from this side. For anyone wondering, cardinals wouldn't become a thing till a couple hundred years after Jerome, and the HRE is here, Numidia is here, and the Atlas Mountains are here. So it's 2-0 Luther so far. I can't imagine that either of these stumbles felt good for Eck. But Eck, to his credit, stayed calm. This wasn't his first debate, and he knew how to come back from a couple stumbles. The day was almost over. If he could just make it to the end without making a huge glaring mistake, well, then he'd have the whole night to prepare a better counterattack. Eck makes a few more arguments, but they're mostly semantic, and then the Greek Orthodox Church keeps catching strays for some reason. My apologies, Reverend Halkias. He finally closes by saying that all the holy men and church fathers agree with him, that Peter was first among the apostles, not just in honor, but in terms of authority, and that Peter would go on to found the greatest church, the one in Rome, and therefore his seat remained one of supreme authority. Thus ended the first day of debate. I know that was a lot, so let's do a quick recap. And don't worry, for the next days, we're going to go a lot faster. Eck says the church has a head, and it's the Pope. Luther says, no, it's not. It's Jesus. Eck says that Jesus' powers are delegated to the Pope. Luther says, no, they're not. All bishops were equal in the times of the early church. To which Eck says, no, they're not. Shut up. You're not smarter than the church fathers. Pretty hard to argue that day one didn't go Luther's way. And decidedly so. And remember how much was on the line for both these guys. Luther was arguing that he wasn't a heretic, that his ideas had merit, and this might possibly be the only public platform where he could do such, whereas Eck's reputation and income was based on this idea that he was a formidable debater. They were both smart guys, but they also both had a real ego problem. Things didn't need to get to the point where it was so do or die, but it had. And now the two were locked in a bitter combat that could well shape both of their futures. The two spent the night recovering from the day and preparing fresh arguments. Although I couldn't find any great accounts of this evening, I can only assume that both were burning the midnight oil to the finish to try and prepare. In one of the strangest coincidences of this entire story, also in Leipzig at the time, was Johann Tetzel. If you recall, the guy who was selling indulgences way back when. You know, what had led to Luther writing his 95 Theses. But this night, or perhaps the following morning, Tetzel would die. I'm sure Luther took that in a way as an omen. After a successful first day, the person who had started all of this was now gone. Part of me wonders if Eck interpreted it the same way. The following morning, Luther went first, as Eck had closed the previous evening. Luther mostly kept to scriptural arguments again, though he did introduce a few more quotes from church fathers to show that they agreed with Luther as well, essentially countering Eck's "what about the fathers" claim with, well, the fathers don't even agree with you. However, what's far more interesting to me is Luther's a lot more aggressive in this opening. He's throwing quite a few more insults at Eck today than he did the day before. When referencing a passage from Paul's letter to the Galatians, in which Paul claims there's no hierarchy between him and Peter, Luther ends with a small dig at Eck. I would like the excellent doctor to read the scriptures more correctly before he recites it. There's a few more very pointed insults, such as, I pass over that of the cardinals, because it is known to all when they began, and Numidia beyond the Atlas Mountains, which does not exist. Whether due to tensions, overconfidence, or something else entirely, Luther was not the cool, aloof interlocutor he'd been before. Luther finished by arguing that when Christ said, I say you are Peter, and upon this rock I shall build my church, the rock there could not be referring to Peter specifically. Instead, it had to refer to faith. Maybe the faith of Peter specifically, but more likely than not, the faith of all the faithful, as from this rock, the entire church was built, not just the church at Rome, which again, wasn't the first church. Furthermore, if it was Peter, well then what happens when Peter sins, as all men do? or even when Peter dies and the rock vanishes. So saying, he yielded back and waited to see what Eck had cooked up the night before. Now, from the first day, you may have gotten the idea that Eck was a fraud, that he had merely debate-broed his way to fame and didn't actually possess any intellectual prowess or academic rigor. Well, Eck is about to show you that his reputation is very much deserved. Also, day 2 covers The Rock a lot more, so get your Dwayne Johnson jokes out now. Eck first references the specific verse in which Peter is named the rock, Matthew 16:18. Remember that one, we're going to come back to it a bunch. In that verse, Christ specifically says, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I shall build my church," implying that, yes, Peter is the rock. Eck uses no less than 13 sources to indicate that everyone thought Peter was the head of the church in the early days, all the way from 4th century church fathers to 11th century councils. Eck wraps up by reminding the audience that the rejection of papal supremacy was part of the Hussite heresy, as well as the earlier Lollard heresy. If Luther cannot draw a clear distinction between his arguments for papal primacy not being divine law and the heretics' arguments for papal primacy not being divine law, well then in effect, he's joining them. Therefore I ask the Venerable Father for forgiveness if I am hostile to the Hussites. For Luther's thesis that the supremacy in the church is a human invention is, according to my low and poor judgment, very much in favor of their errors. With that challenge, Eck yielded back to Luther. Luther, however, was not caught off guard by this argument. His response is the second longest in the entire debate. In fact, they broke for lunch in the middle of Luther's response. He had to finish it when they got back. The only time in the entire debate I noticed that happen. And he begins by picking apart every single one of those sources Eck brought up earlier. It's actually really interesting, truly, but it's also kind of hard to keep track of. One account actually claims that some of the audience members were falling asleep throughout this entire debate. I imagine this section being a particularly sonorous one. As always, more info in the companion documents, but Luther is mostly pointing out that either the Church Fathers are making ambiguous claims as to the meaning of passages, or their genuine overall analyses don't align with Eck's, or that they later contradict themselves in some other place. And further, Eck has yet to provide a genuine instance of divine law or a scriptural passage indicating the Pope should be the head of the church. After which they broke for lunch, and Luther must have been feeling pretty good here. Eck had some good new arguments, but they were nothing that Luther couldn't handle. Thus far, he was doing pretty well. When everyone returned from lunch, as I mentioned, Luther continued, now pivoting into defending himself against Eck's claims that he was a heretic. But I betcha everyone on his side wishes he hadn't. Luther began with, "I answer as before, that I neither want to nor can defend the Bohemian Schism. But it is also certain that among the articles of John Huss, or the Bohemians, many are completely Christian and evangelical, which the general church cannot condemn." At which point, the mood in the room immediately shifted. One eyewitness at the time, a student at the university, wrote that when Luther uttered that line, Duke George said in a voice loud enough to carry across the entire room, "Das Wort die Schucht, that is the will of madness." To everyone in the room, it sounded like Luther was saying, the church cannot condemn these heretics, and further, they have some pretty good ideas. And ultimately, this single moment is basically what everyone would remember. Like, go ahead, look up any summary of the Leipzig debate. They all say that Luther was forced to admit that some of the ideas of the Hussites were okay. But I feel like what those summaries always miss is Luther was not forced to do this. Recall, Luther didn't deny the Pope had authority. He just didn't think that authority came from God. Luther could have easily stayed there. Luther could have easily defended his position from there. But he didn't. As is the recurring theme of this story, I suspect pride got the better of him. He wanted to refute these arguments once and for all. And Luther's overall arguments do make sense here in a way. The Hussite idea that there's one universal church is something that basically every Christian sect agrees with. They just disagree on what that universal church should look like. Luther even points out that several famous saints, St. Basil, St. Gregory, were all Greek Orthodox, and as a result did not acknowledge the Pope's authority, yet were still saints. Were they heretical? There's a part of me that's sympathetic for Luther trying to argue in this way. It's a very sideways argument, in the line of his argument from day one where he says, yes, of course the church has a head, but it's Christ, not the Pope. Here he's saying, yes, of course I agree with some of the Hussite arguments, But those arguments are ones anyone would agree with. The problem being, any good Christian would agree with the heretics is not quite as self-evident as Christ is the rightful head of the church. The moment he'd uttered those words, he'd effectively sealed his fate. And therefore, when he passed it back to Eck, Eck immediately pounced on this mistake. Since the Venerable Father, in order to save his honor, denies that he is a patron of the Bohemians, I would praise him highly if the deeds corresponded to the words. But the latter does not agree with the former, since he unchristianly says that the most harmful errors of the Hussites are exceedingly Christian. And though no one really noticed it, I do find it a bit ironic that Eck, who'd been calling the Greek Orthodox Church heretical this entire time, in the end would say that Luther was the one mixing the Greek saints with the heretics. Now, I think Luther almost certainly knew he'd messed up here. Maybe it was due to the change in the crowd, the Duke's words, or even the way Eck's mood had seemingly changed. So when Eck said that last part, Luther interrupted. Eck was lying. Luther didn't seek to provide cover for the heretics, and he thought any schisms in the church should be condemned. To which Eck replied he'd prefer if that could be proven in the course of the debate, adding that just as truth and light went against Satan, so did heretics go against holy men. Eck really did have a way with words, especially when he knew he was winning. He'd open basically every point he'd make with something to the effect of, "The Venerable Father must forgive me if he was unwilling or unable to understand what I meant," and plenty of, "How modestly and humbly the Venerable Father promised that he alone would oppose so many church fathers." But of course, all that was just fluff. Those were just the arguments Eck had prepared prior to Luther's misstep. Now he pivoted to really striking for the heart. "I believe that it is frightening to all Christ's faithful that the Venerable Father does not hesitate to say that some of the Hussite and Wesselite articles were eminently Christian and evangelical." Whereupon Luther interrupts again. Eck is lying. Luther never said the movements were Christian. He merely said they were evangelical. According to another eyewitness, Eck would go to the transcripts. If you remember a little earlier in the video, indeed, Luther did say that they were Christian. After which Eck responded with, "If you truly think they aren't heretical, prove it." Luther would interrupt once more a few minutes later when Eck made a similar claim, but Eck wouldn't even bother responding this time. Eck's remarks would bring day 2 to a close, but the last thing he said actually really struck me. I almost wonder if it wasn't a coded message specifically meant for Luther, because it referenced something that Luther had written to Eck personally about when he'd sent him his Asterisks. "Therefore I ask the Venerable Father to accept what has been said, either by others or by me. I am not always careless with my words, as if in an effort to flatter, for I haven't learned to flatter, nor do I know how to flatter." You see now why I wanted to make this video? Like, my God, what a reversal from the first day. You couldn't write something this dramatic. And there's moments in here that almost feel like they're from a movie. Remember when Luther was interrupting Eck on the first day, saying, cardinals in Numidia, and that made Eck look worse? Well, now here on the second day, Luther tries to interrupt Eck again, but it just makes Luther look worse. It's a total reversal of the first day. It's crazy. And to top it all off, it's clear from Luther's writings that the thing that bugged him more than anything else was being called a heretic, that people were just associating his ideas with another movement to avoid having to deal with them at all. So to have this be the thing that kneecaps him, to have this be the thing that makes him lose the crowd, that must have been like his worst nightmare come to life. But that was just day 2. The debate's not over yet. An interesting aside here, a notice was actually posted outside the debate hall before day 3 began. It requested that both Luther and Eck refrain from mutual recriminations and from harm to reputation, and that factions and their adherents should not do anything against the peace. However, judging from how day 3 went, I don't think Luther or Eck saw that notice. Luther opens, and it feels like he has spent the entire night stewing. He even opens by trying to claim that Eck has broken the rules of the debate, and therefore forfeited. Yesterday, the excellent doctor presumed the office of a judge against the contract of the agreement made, and has so often declared and proclaimed me to be a heretic. If you're ever in a public debate and you turn to the judge, it's usually not because you're winning. In terms of Simon the Rock Peter, Luther first brings up a few commentaries that seem to agree with him that there's no way that Peter himself was the rock. Rather, it was Peter's love of Jesus was the rock. Luther backs this up by pointing out that Jesus says Peter is the rock prior to the Last Supper, prior to his arrest and trial and crucifixion. And famously, the night that Jesus was arrested, Peter would deny Christ 3 times. Not exactly a great rock if you are literally denying Christ. Secondly, even after the ascension, Paul, remember, not an apostle, would scold Peter for not living in accordance with the scripture. Not living in accordance with the scripture, again, not exactly rock material. Also, not really head material, especially when a bishop can point out your shortcomings with impunity, and then that pointing out of your shortcomings makes it into the actual Bible. Pivoting to covering for himself yesterday, Luther argues that if we were able to speak to the Bohemians as equals and address their concerns, there may yet be a way to unify the church, in Bohemia at least. Referencing that Paul, in his letter to the Galatians, referred to the Galatians as brother, despite them falling to Jewish faithlessness. Yeah. He then says that though Eck, in order to arouse hatred, shouted a lot about how all good Christians should be frightened that Luther refused to condemn all the Hussite articles, 2 of the articles that were condemned were almost word for word lifted from the writings of St. Augustine, specifically from his work on John. To what Eck had been arguing this entire time, were the words of a saint truly condemnable? Similarly, it's unclear if the church or the council that specifically condemned the Hussites believed that every article of theirs was heretical, as the specific document stated that some are heretical, some erroneous, some blasphemous, some presumptuous, some seditious, and some offensive to godly ears. Luther goes on to say, even the truest truth may be accused of being offensive to the ears, as happened to Christ. And therefore, I have been accused of being a heretic all too hastily, and without Eck's usual modesty, since it is clear how unreasonably and boldly he accuses me of being a heretic. For the rest of his answer, Luther focuses on the actual arguments around primacy, but it's mostly just going through sources again. He ends with the line, "This may be enough with my answer to the objections of Dr. Johann Eck about the 13th thesis of the power and primacy of the Pope. I leave this to the judgment of the judges and all readers." It was an okay opening. He did all right, but I still feel like the damage from day 2 was pretty severe, and if not decisive at this point, things were certainly at least leaning Eck's way. But there was still time. Days 1 and 2 both saw it turn pretty rapidly on a single line, so there was still a chance that Luther could turn this around. But Eck knew that too, and so he unveiled his secret weapon, running down the clock. Seriously, this is the longest answer in the entire thing by far. And I want to read Eck's first statement just to show you not just how wordy it is, but how much Eck is clearly stretching for time. Since the Venerable Father accuses me of having taken the office of a judge, I must state this is not the case. I am a disputator, nor did I call him a heretic, but I said that his statements are favorable to the heretics, and especially to the Bohemians. And that I say favorable, mainly because he took the liberty of making the atrocious statement that some of the articles of Jan Hus, which were rejected by the holy Kostnitz Concilium, are exceedingly Christian and evangelical. Let us rather go to the point. Sounds kind of like padding out a paper so you can just hit the word count. Now, to be fair, Eck did add a few new arguments, but the vast majority of what he added was just new sources, because what better way to extend time than by reading a bunch of quotes? The only real things to note are a few more gospel quotes in which Jesus made the apostles priests, and another where Jesus told Peter to feed his sheep, something that he told no one else. Eck also refused to acknowledge the Hussite articles, though, to be fair, his arguments are okay. Check the companion doc if you want to read more about that. And of course, constantly throughout, he keeps making small digs at Luther and implying he's a heretic. I think what happened here was simple. Eck knew that he had won. Luther had essentially admitted to being a heretic, so all Eck had to do now was just run the clock out so Luther didn't have a chance to mount an actually effective defense of himself. Now, I should note, since Eck's thesis was technically the one being attacked, Luther got to go last. And in cases where the person going last didn't have enough time to say everything they wanted to, they were allowed to add a written statement to the record which would be sent off to the judges. But that didn't exactly do much for the people sitting in the room, nor for any of the letters those people would write to all their friends and family around the country. And in the end, who won a debate often came down far more to popular opinion than what any specific judge said. Eck wraps up by saying he would like to add even more, but time won't allow it, and so he passes it back to Luther, who has only an hour to respond. Now, an hour might sound like a lot, but if we assume that Luther's word count here is an hour, Eck had just spoken for like 8. There simply was no way Luther would have had enough time to respond. And Luther knows this. His answer is fairly rushed and jumbled. in the end just saying that he doesn't have time to defend himself against the claims of heresy. He'll just submit a written statement covering everything else he wants to say. And with that, day 3 came to a close. Looked like the debate had gone for Eck. All that was left now was to see what the judges had to say. But then something unexpected happened. Before everyone left, the Duke called Luther and Eck over. I couldn't find a record of exactly what happened, but it seems that the Duke suggested that Luther get a little time the following morning in order to give the rest of his answer in full. Luther jumped at the chance, and with the order of the Duke, Eck had no choice but to agree. Eck was given a little time to compensate, but in the spirit of fairness, Luther would still get the last word, much as he would have had tonight. Thus, the next morning saw the start of day 4 of the 3-day debate. Eck spoke briefly about things he'd already covered, and then ended with, "I am ready to listen, under the condition that Luther, while he has the office of a responder, does not cunningly put himself in the position of an opponent at the end of the action." Basically, Eck was prepared to listen, but he would speak up if Luther introduced new lines of attack. And then it was Luther's turn. I don't know what Luther did the night before, but I can tell you one thing. He hadn't come here to play. He'd come to win. After a brief opening, thanking the Duke for allowing Luther some extra time, he chucked a little dig at Eck, saying that he had used up too much time the day before in a spiteful manner, and then switched to speaking German. Up until now, the debate had been taking place in Latin, but Luther said that he wanted to speak to the common man. In German, Luther said that he did not dispute papal supremacy as a concept, merely where it originated from, that it was a matter of tradition more than divine law. Luther was not telling people to ignore the Pope and frankly wanted the Church to remain whole, but he did think it was important to pay proper homage to God and ensure the Pope did not confuse the faithful with claims to powers that were not intrinsically his, but merely things that were just awarded to him by the true power of the Church. Luther then continues the disputation itself, switching back to Latin, and again brings up Matthew 16:18, pointing out that the fact that he and Eck have gone back and forth about this passage for the past several days implies that the passage is ambiguous, and therefore Eck can't hide behind it as proof of divine law when the fathers and even the 2 men in the room couldn't agree on that. Luther then goes back into church history and mentions a moment where Pope Victor, pope in the late 2nd century AD, tried to excommunicate a group of Eastern bishops over a disagreement about when to celebrate the dates of Easter, something that the Greek Orthodox and Catholics do not agree on even to this day. Yet this attempted excommunication would fail, with both church fathers and other bishops actually censuring the Pope. The Pope! Well, I mean the Bishop of Rome, but still, you get the point. This is a fairly damning piece of evidence. This is the other early bishops going against the will of the Pope, speaking against his authority. But on top of that, the fact that he had said this and church fathers had disagreed with him also spoke against the idea of the Pope as being infallible. I should also mention, Luther holds himself back a lot more today. Gone is the aggressive personal attacks of day 2 and 3. He mostly just sticks to the sources and let them speak for themselves. It's long and it's dense, but it's solid. At one point, when referencing Eck's earlier point about feed my sheep, Luther spends at least 2 hours picking it apart. That whole scene in the Gospels is like 6 sentences. And unlike Eck, he's not just stretching for time here. He's using grammar, he's using the evidence of other church fathers, he's even using basic rhetorical devices. It's a fairly brutal takedown. He even attacks Eck's character, saying, "I pass over Eck's attacks on mendicant orders. Even this wretched clothing torments the doctor." For the record, mendicant orders took a vow of poverty, and Eck had been dressed to the nines since day 1. Also, to be fair, Eck wasn't a member of a mendicant order or anything. Luther's just sort of attacking him on moral grounds. Having destroyed Eck's argument sources and even lifestyle, Luther then moved on to, "Therefore, as the answer is finished, it remains that I also present what moves me against the excellent doctor." At which point, according to the transcripts, Eck began shouting. Eck shouted that if Luther was going to attack, he should be allowed to respond. At which point Luther supposedly lost his cool and started shouting back at Eck that if that was the case, the debate would never be over. Despite which, Eck had been debate-broing Luther for basically 3 days straight. Luther should be allowed a little leeway here. The shouting match got so bad that the Duke eventually had to get involved. He ruled that Luther should be allowed to continue, but Eck would be allowed to respond, and even added an additional day on top of this one so the debate could continue. However, I'm going to save us all the trouble. The theology side of the debate is basically over. Luther's attack would just be him restating stuff he'd already brought up before from Galatians and Corinthians. When Eck took back over, he basically just started calling Luther a bunch of names and hurling insults at him. Eck was furious. As much as I normally hedge that with things like I'm sure or I'm guessing, you can read it. He's really mad. But that makes sense. I mean, he'd had it. He'd had it. If the Duke just hadn't extended the debate, it would have been X by all rights, but he had. I assume after that, the Duke pulled them aside, because for the final day of the debate, they were a lot more polite, although, again, they don't really tread any new ground. At the end of it all, it had boiled down to this. Luther did not think Matthew 16:18, Peter as the rock, was unambiguous enough to indicate that Christ had appointed there to be a single head of the church, especially given how Peter had been chastised and overruled by his contemporaries. Eck, on the other hand, thought Luther's words were a little too close to the words of heretics, and that Luther hadn't done nearly enough to refute the interpretations of the church fathers. The rest of the debates, according to eyewitnesses, weren't really that interesting or anything to write home about. In fact, plenty of them skip over the rest of the debates altogether. Eck seemed to agree with Luther on both indulgences and penance, and Luther sort of stumbled a bit in the debate on purgatory, but at the end they still found they agreed far more than they disagreed. And this is what, to me, kind of makes this such a sad story. These two guys agreed on like 90% of everything they talked about here. Luther would even write after this event that rumors said Eck wouldn't even have debated Luther if it weren't for his specific argument on papal primacy, which adds to the idea that this debate had a lot more to do with wounded pride than any genuine concern over issues of theology. But I know the question you're probably asking right now. After all that, who won? Well, if you ask the faculty at Leipzig University, they'd all say that Eck won, and had done so handily. In fact, after the rest of his debate with Carlstadt, Eck stuck around for an additional 9 days, partying it up. But something had changed. Many of the eyewitnesses to this event wrote their friends and family about it. We can find a flurry of letters from all over Germany. Luther wasn't an unknown before this debate, that's true, but his fame was more on the level of a YouTuber than, say, a movie star. The nobility and people who paid attention to theology knew who he was, but he didn't have a huge amount of reach beyond that. Now suddenly there was a story of a small German priest who was rather unknown going up against the might of the entire Catholic Church, and by some accounts, winning. A lot of these letters indicate that Luther's arguments did seem to carry the day with a lot of people. Even some of Eck's most loyal fanboys would acknowledge that Luther was a smart guy who had really good mastery over Scripture. Now, as to who the official winner of the debate was, well, it was technically sent for judgment to 2 universities, the University of Erfurt and the University of Paris. Erfurt returned a judgment fairly quickly. Inconclusive. They weren't going to pick a winner. Paris took a bit longer to respond, and it seems like this made Eck a little nervous. As much as in the room and to the Leipzig faculty afterwards, Eck acted like he was the clear winner and there was no doubt in it, his private letters indicated he wasn't so sure. On July 24th, a little over a week after the debate had ended, Eck sent a letter to his friend Jakob Hoogstrot at the University of Lyon. The letter is weirdly full of excuses. There were 2 of them and only 1 of me. They were able to use books, whereas I had to do the whole thing from memory. They were taking home copies of the transcripts every night, whereas I didn't see a single copy until all the debates were over. It was also peppered with little, "I most earnestly request you defend the faith," and "they should judge immediately and conclude what is in accordance with our faith." There's even a not-so-subtle, "you should do this for the sake of the one whom I serve," aka the Pope. Yet despite Eck's attempts, far from taking the effort approach of saying they couldn't determine a winner, Paris wouldn't respond at all. At least, not until well over a year later, by which time the situation had changed quite dramatically. Eck, growing more and more frustrated that he didn't have some tangible evidence he'd won the debate, wrote to many of the local lords in Germany, urging them to ban Luther's teachings, including Luther's own Prince Elector, our old friend Frederick III. But he met with little success. It was in the hands of the people now. To me, this feels like Eck is just desperately grasping at straws, hoping that some official body will tell him, you know what, yes, you're right, Luther's wrong. Luther's positions would grow and change after this, getting a bit more radical, but he'd write to a friend of his that what led to that change was Eck. Eck's incipient arguing and wicked defenses had opened Luther's eyes to the true evil of the papacy. The following year, January 1520, Eck would head to Rome at the invitation of the Pope, whereupon he would present another attack on Luther's theses. While there, Eck would urge the Roman Curia, an administrative body of priests, to take decisive action against Luther and ban his teachings or have him excommunicated, but it seems most were still hesitant to take such a drastic action. He would eventually wind up working on the very papal bull that led to Luther's eventual excommunication. And so, a year later, Eck returned to the site of their fateful debate. Now the triumphant conqueror, with the official document showing that he had been right all along. He unfurled it and started to read. When he got to the part about Luther's excommunication, the crowd started booing and jeering. In the end, Eck would be forced to flee, first Leipzig, then Saxony as a whole, out of fear he'd be seized by the mob. Whereas in December of that year, the day Luther was supposed to appear in Rome to recant before the Pope, he would publicly burn the papal bull in front of a cheering crowd. Eck and Luther would go on to become the faces of their respective movements. Luther, of course, the Protestants, and Eck, the ultra-Catholics, the traditionalists. In fact, the term Lutheran, a term used to this day to describe the sect of people who agree with Luther's teachings, was actually originally an insult coined by Eck. When I set out to make this video, I was trying to answer a question. At what point was the Protestant Reformation inevitable? When was it too late to salvage the church? What I found, unsurprisingly, is there are many answers to that question. So it ever goes when peering back into history. But at the end of all my research, I really think it was the letter that we started this video with. The moment that Eck and Luther were introduced. I truly don't believe Eck meant to offend Luther with his Obelisks. Eck and Luther agreed on a lot. And given how caught off guard Eck was with Luther's argument that it wasn't the Pope that was the head of the church, but instead Christ, I wonder if the two had been able to sit down and talk it out. Eck would have come around on Luther's nuance. Perhaps Luther could have stated things in a clearer way, and in the end, none of this conflict would have happened in the first place. But ultimately, we'll never know. Instead, all we have is this story. The story of a broken friendship and a split church. If you made it to the end, by way of thanks, I'm going to give you a little treat. By far, the weirdest thing I came across in my research. I knew that no matter where I put it in the video, it was going to just completely ruin the tone. Frankly, it's probably going to ruin the tone of the ending too, but I knew there was no way I could leave this out of the video. So here goes. This is from a letter from Pfeiffer, Chancellor of Saxony. Duke George had a one-eyed court jester. He always stood at his side in the auditorium, and as there are always joking and funny people among the great ones at court, they made the jester believe. Luther argued with Eck about the jester's marriage. Eck did not want him to be given a wife. Luther, however, spoke for him. The jester got angry about this, and as often as he came into the auditorium with the prince, he made a nasty face at Eck. Eck, seeing this, covered his right eye with his index finger and looked at the jester again with a scowl. The fool, noticing that his one-eyedness was being advanced, as was the truth, bitterly and shamefully attacked Eck with a great clamor. The assembly laughed quite a bit about this, and thus a little fun was added to the heat of the disputation. So don't worry. Even in the worst of times, there's always some fun to be had in the mocking of the disabled. Seriously though, like, what? Like, they just lied to a guy who probably didn't know Latin, so he couldn't understand the debate. Remember, they weren't debating in German. Then he believes them, so shoots daggers at Eck, and then Eck responds by mocking him for having one eye, which obviously upsets the guy, so he yells back, because again, he thought this guy was arguing he shouldn't be allowed to have a wife, and that's the punchline? Like, was Eck even in on this, or did he just randomly mock the disabled guy? Is that what he did? Was he the kind of guy who just randomly mocks someone like that? Is the humor literally just, look at this idiot who believed me when I lied to him? Is that what German humor is? Anyway, if you made it this far, I really do appreciate it. Please, like, comment, subscribe, blah, 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 call to action, all that fun stuff. This video genuinely came out of nowhere for me. I was trying to make a video about the printing press, believe it or not. That's what this video was originally supposed to be about. But when I started looking into the debates and reading the letters and stuff, I realized there was a really interesting, really personal story here that I just really ended up wanting to tell. I'm just a vessel. The research takes me where it will. Got some more stuff coming soon. Think you're all going to like it. And until next time, take care.